I was not born or raised in California. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and graduated from college in North Carolina, but moved to the West Coast soon after. And when I say soon after, I think I was on the road when they were putting away the folding chairs for graduation ceremony. And it was a cliche at that time where I grew up and essentially all over the eastern part of the United States to want to move to California once you graduated college or high school. And there was a stereotype that was widely kind of held back east, probably still held, that California was a place for superficial, sort of restless people. It was like sort of when a middle-aged man buys a motorcycle, you know. It was just something that people do before they came back and got serious about life. Well, I was determined that I was going to not live up to that stereotype, and so I wanted to turn to something that would give me a sense of California's rootedness, and I ended up turning to literature. And the great writers such as writers we all know, Joe Didion, Kevin Starr, Carrie McWilliams, this kind of pantheon of writers. And of course, right in the middle of that pantheon was the great James T. Houston. And of course, a few years later, when I had the enormous privilege of being a journalist in Santa Cruz and going to sit with Jim in that beautiful old house near Twin Lakes Beach and just sort of talk about, not just about writing, but about life. And it was just, it really kind of blew my mind that this man was interested in my story, as prosaic as it was, because it was very much like his parents' story when they drifted to California in the early part of the last century. That was a different milieu, a different time, but Jim was always interested in that kind of impulse to go west and to and for creative people to kind of figure out life once they got there. I remember a few years ago I interviewed the noted playwright Luis Valdez of El Teatro Campesino, and he told me that he has his theater company in San Juan Bautista because it's near the San Andreas Fault, and there is creative energy coming out of the earth, and he is tapping into that. Now, he may have been putting me on, and he probably was, but I think Jim had perhaps not that explicit sense of that, but he sort of recognized that this area had a certain creative air to it. And what I'm going to read for you today, I went into my garage and pulled out boxes from the books that I read when I first moved here 25 some odd years ago, and found a collection called Unknown California, in which Jim has a piece in here that is very pertinent to today. It is Jim's encounter and interview with Steve Jobs of Apple, and it's called Mighty the Apple. A while back, someone wrote to the San Jose Mercury News complaining about the way the term Silicon Valley turns up more and more often as a synonym for Santa Clara Valley. They're not the same, the citizen cried out, and I agree with him. The valley called Santa Clara has been here in its present shape for many thousands of years, a flat and fertile basin, in times past a submerged and southerly extension of San Francisco Bay, and still bordered by parallel ridges of the Coast Range. Silicon Valley is a very recent event, and it exists much more in the mind than it does in the landscape. Physically, it is a collection of low buildings that have been added, laid into various niches and cleared spaces like a scattering of heat-resistant ceramic tiles around and among the various towns that now contain it. Palo Alto, Los Altos, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Cupertino, Santa Clara, San Jose. The four long, low buildings that house Apple computers clear, sand-colored with red roof tiles in Mission Manor are so new, green plastic nursery tape still flutters around the saplings and stays outside. They have to be new. 6 years ago, the personal computer industry did not exist. At the moment, according to the fellow I am about to meet, it is the fastest growing industry in the history of American business. In 6 years, he will soon be telling me, it goes from $0 to $1 billion. I should just add here that this was written in 1982, which qualifies as probably the Mesozoic era of personal computing. Steve Jobs is the first to acknowledge that Apple could have only happened within the unique support system this valley has to offer. He feels a sense of lineage that goes back at least as far as the 1930s, and he feels immersed in an environment he is eager to talk about. He calls it the culture of entrepreneurial risk. Quote, "You do not get penalized for failure here," he says. "You are expected to try things. If you go out on your own and try something and fail, your career isn't over. You can actually be more valuable to the next person you work for because of what you learned in the process," unquote. Adventurous risk is all around you, along with the legendary results, the breakthrough devices that keep this atmosphere charged up and ever challenging. Steve's voice rises with urgency and fills the office when he exclaims, "Look what comes out of this valley." Basically, the first integrated circuit, the first microprocessor was invented 10 miles from here, the first personal computer, now the first genetics companies. Probably 5 out of the top 10 things we're going to look back 50 years from now and say, these are the things that impacted the world the most. 5 of them are going to come from right here in this valley. I think he underestimated that a little bit. The passion in his voice has the ring of patriotism, making it that much clearer to me that Steve Jobs is talking about his true homeland and native surroundings, this volatile mix of microchips and circuit boards and commerce in the fast lane. He grew up in the midst of it, with a native's grasp of how it all works. The more he talks, the more I began to wonder where this new valley had actually come from, this little country unto itself, where, among other things, a new kind of apple had sprouted. What was it doing here? When I finished high school in Santa Clara Valley back in 1951, the word silicon was still something maybe heard mentioned once in chemistry class and never remembered. By the time Steve Jobs finished high school 21 years later, an entirely new type of valley had made its appearance, superimposed upon the original. But why? Why here in a sunny basin that for 100 years had been cherished for its apricots, pears, walnuts, peaches, and prunes? The new industry did not require any of the things the old farms and ranches required, and simply vision and hustle and a gambler's nerve. The basic ingredient is a crystalline substance that can be processed in labs anywhere, but happens to be processed in large quantities here in some of the same low buildings spread around among the suburbs, often in the shade of surviving walnut trees. It is strange. It is almost out of character in a state where most of the industry and so much of the fame has been directly tied to the physical endowments: gold, oil, soil, harbors. If you add climate to that list, electronics too might be said to have a regional and earthly anchor. Climate explains a lot of what goes on in California and has helped keep this industry centered here. But climate is not where it begins. When I started asking around, everyone sooner or later mentioned Stanford University and a two-way flow of brain power between New England and the Bay Area. The phrase critical mass also came up several times. A gathering of ingredients which acquires its own magnetic effect. A clustering begins.